Okay, so the topic for today I've chosen is going to be the deep dive on MVC, but also explaining different concepts like what is an abstraction, what is single responsibility principle, and how is that framed. Cool. So the definition of MVC is that it is a design pattern that helps solve some computer science problems. And MVC stands for MVC. So the M stands for model, V stands for view, and C stands for controller. This is 10:30. So if we break down the definition, if we say that it's a design pattern, another way to look at it is that it's creating an abstraction in your code. So the next question that comes into mind is like, what is an abstraction, right? So an abstraction is nothing but a layer in between two systems. So the example that I like to use is, imagine I want my food heated, right? If I want my food heated, I can directly go and take my food and put it in a microwave and start the microwave, and 5 minutes later my food is hot. Or I can go and choose to put it on the fire and heat the food. Right? In both these cases, I get my desired result, which is my food being hot. But the problem with that is I, as a person who wants my food heated, needs to know how to operate a microwave and needs to know how to start a fire, right? Both these functions. And that's not always desirable. Instead, what I could do is I could have my friend who's in the middle. I can give my food to that person and be like, hey, can you heat my food for you? Can you heat my food, right? Can you please heat my food? And he or she can go and then put the food in the microwave or the fire or on a stove, and I get back my hot food. So I didn't have to know what they use to heat the food, right? So the person is now like a layer in between the food heating process. I only have to interact with this layer, right? So that is what is an abstraction, right? I've created this layer in between my two systems where I am somebody who wants food heated, and then there's this food heating service that exists. And I only have to talk to that layer. So what benefits does this give us? Now, me as a system, a separate system, has to know nothing about how the heat system works, right? I only have to know how to tell the person that I want my food heated. So that's the only language we use to communicate. Whereas how they do it is hidden behind the layers. So that's what an abstraction is, right? So now when we come back to model view controller, what we're doing is we are dividing essentially web applications into 3 parts, which is the data part, where we have to look up some data, either from a database or a file or HTTP service, and then we sort of wrap that in a model layer. Right? So all of that is essentially in this abstraction called a model. And the only way to interact with it is to ask it questions like, give me data for this user, or give me, or save data for this user, or update this user. These are sort of the entry points that you can talk to the system. Right? So that's the model layer. Similarly, the view layer is responsible just for generating the UI. So the view layer has no idea that the model layer even exists. Right? They're 2 separate entities. And this is what is also known as single responsibility principle. And what this says is that each system should only be responsible for one thing. So the model layer is only responsible for maintaining the data, nothing else. And each system is sort of isolated, right? They don't know about each other. So the model layer doesn't know that the view layer even exists. Or the model layer doesn't even know that the controller exists. We haven't even spoken about controller, but there may be many systems in your application. Nobody really knows about each other. So the model layer responsible for managing data, right? Similarly, the view layer is responsible for the UI. So now that we have these different systems which are sort of floating in their own space, there has to be something that connects the two, right? So somebody asks for data for a user because the user now wants to go to the profile page, and once you have the data, you want to send it to the view layer. So you want to show the profile page to the user, right? So there's somebody in the middle who is communicating with both the systems. So that's what the controller is. So the controller links the model and view with, I guess, actions is a good word for it. So user performs an action saying, I want to go and see my profile page, right? So that action is now going to the controller, and the controller is responsible for figuring out which data to get from the model layer and which view layer to send it to, or which part of the view layer to send it to, right? So in your view layer, you may have many things, many different pages. You may have a page for the profile page, you may have a page for showing a particular post, creation of a post, all these different pages. And they are essentially templates because they need some data to be able to be rendered, right? So has everyone here used like a templating engine like Pug or EJS, right? So in Pug and EJS, you can essentially provide what is known as a template and then have variables in there, right, which are populated in runtime. To say like in runtime, I'm going to like show details for this user. But before that, I have no idea what the data is going to be in there. I'm just going to sort of apply this data, merge it with this template, and I get some HTML. So that's essentially what the controller is doing, where it's fetching data from the view layer, model layer, and sending it across to the view layer. So there's a good diagram if you look at the MVC pattern on Wikipedia. So this one, right? So it's essentially this cyclic flow of control. So if user is the browser, right? So the browser will generate an action, right? So the user here is a browser, and then action will sort of be caught by the controller layer, right? And the controller layer will figure out what action it is, and then essentially ask the model for some data. Be like, either ask for some data or send some data to the model, because depending on what the action is. If I want to create a new user, then I have to like send data to the database, to the model layer to say, save this data into the database. But if it's like fetching data, I will essentially get back some data, right? In both cases, the model layer will return whether your operation was successful or not okay, right? And that has to be handled as well. So once that happens, the model layer, so essentially this is sort of misleading in the sense there is no direct connection between the model and the view layer. The model will send back data to the controller, and the controller will essentially update the view. So I'm going to like draw a slightly different version of this. So let's see. Oops. So here I have the user in my browser, and that sort of goes to my controller, right? And what I'm going to do is create an action, and then the action is going to essentially trigger a call to my model to either get data, right? And then the model returns some data. So this is like the data. And then the controller will essentially go to the view layer and send the data across. And then the view layer is going to respond with HTML, and that sort of goes back here. Right, so step one is the action gets generated. Step two is I'm going to request data or send data across to the model layer. Step three is I get back data from the model layer. Step four is I send data to the view layer. Step five is I get back HTML, and then step six is I send that back across to the user. So one thing which is interesting is, in this case, you're going to be like, oh, where's the database, right? So somewhere inside my model layer is the database, and the whole idea about this is like there is an abstraction, which is the details about the fact that there's a database is hidden away, right? Like nobody really needs to know that there is a database other than the model layer. So in here, there is like an internal thing, like this is a database here, right? This is like within the model system. Similarly, in the view system, there could be EJS, or Pug, whatever you need to use in order to generate your generate HTML. The controller doesn't need to know about that. The controller just says, here is some data, and this is the template I want, or this is the template I want to use. Do your thing. They don't need to know whether it's EJS or Pug or whatever. Right? That's like an implementation detail of the view layer. So let's look at some code to kind of concretize this idea. So there is this project which you're going to start looking at called Contact Snapshot Starter. And this has some of the, not Java, this has some of the ideas that I'm talking about. So in my directory, I like to organize it as like source and test, top level, and then public is for all of my static files, like some sort of CSS and images, so stuff like that. So in my source folder, I kind of have the model view folders, so the models folders, and the views folders. And the server sort of represents the controller layer. Okay? So it's MVS in this case, not really MVC. And so looking at my models, now the database becomes an implementation detail for my model layer, right? Remember we spoke about how the database is just hidden. Nobody really knows about the database other than the models layer, right? So from the outside, it just looks like there is a models. There isn't really a database that the controller really knows about. So in my database folder, I would have all of the things that I need to in order to make my database work, which is my my database connection, using the PG promise and PG the connection string, and then all of my SQL statements, right? So I have functions here to perform CRUD operations on my contacts table. So I have a table called contacts in this project, and there's like different functions like create, find all, find by ID. These are just functions that, depending on your application, you will either have or not have. right? And these are all using SQL here. Any questions so far? Feel free to interrupt me and ask questions, by the way.
I guess I had one because I've seen name this file contacts. Like, what would be a convention for naming these types of files?
Good question. So the convention is always looking at the kind of resource or data that you're operating with, right? So I'm operating with the data contacts. So it's going to be contacts. I always try to name my files. So the word I like to use is resource, which means like what is the data that I'm acting. And the resource is determined by the business that you're trying to, the domain that you're in, right? So if you're in a world of Facebook, then you would have users, posts, comments. So that's like the domain. Okay, those are the words.
That website you're trying to show me, that's called Restuler.
Restuler?
Yeah, it's very useful. If you actually look it up right now, it actually helps you name all those files. Rescue log, like that.
Restuler. Yeah. Yeah, so this gives you like routing names. So like for your routes. I think our question was more about like just file names.
Oh no, but this is using file names too. So you just like kind of name it like articles, and then like inside of there you just have like /new, then you post a slash, then you put get ID. So then like even if you like the desk resource inside, it tells you how to do like articles, and then like be like desk resource articles, things like that. So it's very useful.
Yeah. So this is like if you want. So we'll get to RESTful routing, like how to name your routes. There's a specific standard that you can follow to kind of get your names of your routes. But if you're specifically thinking about the name of your files, based on which folder you're in, I would always call it based on the resource that I'm looking at. Oh, no worries. So the name of the file would be the resource name, and then the name of the function would be the action that I'm performing. It's always the analogy I like to use is noun and verbs. So the noun is the name of the resource that I'm acting on, and verb is the name of the function that I'm going to write. So the verb could be find by ID or like find by email, right? So those are the verbs that I'm trying to perform, and that's the name of the function. And notice that the name of the function never really has the name of the resource, because which file it is in is going to tell me which resource it's acting. Okay, so now, so the intention was I wanted to show you was that the database is an implementation detail of my model layer, right? The model layer, so the controller is directly talking to the model layer. There is no direct connection between the controller and the DB. That means nowhere in my routes will I ever import or require the database. I will only require the model file, right? So in my models, I have a file called contacts as well, right? So there's sort of this one-to-one mapping of the file inside models and the file inside the database. So this is sort of the, remember the analogy I was using was if I'm heating my microwave, I could directly do it, or I could have a person in the middle. So this contacts file is the person in the middle. This contacts file will then talk to the database. So the only person that's going, so the controller is going to require this model file, and we're going to see that. So in here, what I'm doing is delegation. So have you heard of the term delegation before? Everybody knows what delegation is? So delegation is the example that I use where I want to heat my food and I'm asking somebody else to do it. That's delegation. It's like I don't want to do it, you do it for me, right? So that's kind of delegating the responsibility. So this is essentially delegating the actual DB calls. Right, so the actual SQL statements and the SQL queries are all being delegated because the database the file inside the database folder is the one which contains all the SQL functions. Right? We saw that a second ago, which is, let me have both these files open actually. So here, right, so this is the DB contacts on the right, and this is the models contacts on the left. So the models contacts on the left is the one which is requiring DB contacts, and then this is delegating. So delegating essentially in function just means calling the function downstream. That's what delegation is, right? In functions, you can only delegate by saying this layer just calls the other function. So if you're telling me, heat the food, I could tell Justin to heat the food. So that's like me delegating stuff, right? So the same message gets passed on. So in functions, the only thing you can do is call another function.
So can you pass down through model? Is that Swift delegating?
So model contacts, yeah. On the left, the function is being delegated to the one inside of DB create. So the DB contacts, models DB contacts is the one which actually has the real function, right? Which is like the insert into contacts, blah, blah, blah. The one on the left is delegating that and calling the function on the right. Right, so db.create is essentially this function on the right. So when I call this function create, it's essentially going to call that function inside DB. Mm-hmm. So, right. So now going back to our diagram, the controller layer does not know about the DB file, right? And how did we accomplish that? Is because now we have this sort of abstraction here called models contacts, which contains all of the functions that it's sort of like publicly exporting it to the controller layer. So in my controller, I'm going to only require models contacts. Right? I'm never going to require models/db/contacts because nobody knows about it. All of those functions have been sort of delegated from the models contacts file. So now in here, when I say, when I go to the, create new contact route, I just call contacts.create, right? Which is essentially the function which is delegating. So if we go, let me go back to that file. Right, so create is essentially calling db create. So in here, when I'm calling create, it's essentially calling the models create, which is going to eventually call db create. So it's like a delegation. So the question, so does anyone have a question about this? So one question that you may have is why am I even doing this? Yeah,
I think actually I finally see it. This is much more modular and you can reuse that code as well, right? Because by not putting the resource in the name of the function, you can use it like pretty generically.
Right, so that is like the naming convention, but I'm saying why are we even creating this models contacts file, and why don't we just have models DB contacts? And that's just the one file that exists and everybody just requires that. So in this diagram, there's a direct connection between the controller to the DB. Right? Why don't we just do that? That could be a good question. And does anyone know why?
I think because we can then abstract it out where the DB could be anything.
Mm-hmm.
You can always plug in another DB, right?
Right. So that's the idea. So tomorrow, if I say, okay, let's say this was, let's say if this was Postgres, right? Tomorrow I can change this to DB like awesome and change it to like MySQL or something, right? And then nobody really needs to know. The controller doesn't know that something was changed. The view doesn't know because view doesn't even have a connection. But the essential idea is the implementation details are not known by the caller. That way you can change things and things still work, so long as you stick to the contract. When I say the contract, I mean this. So long as these functions don't change on the left. You can change all of the stuff on the right, right? But everyone is going to still call models.create, model/contacts.create, models/contacts.findAll. Okay. So what is single responsibility principle? Oops. So can someone tell me the definition, thinking of the name now and understanding what responsibilities are? What is somebody's intuition of what it could be? What is single responsibility principle?
Something that's only responsible for one thing at a time.
Yeah?
Knows nothing about anything else.
Okay. Cool. So let's look at the official definition. So that states that every module or class should have responsibility over a single part of the functionality provided by the software. So that the responsibility should be entirely encapsulated by the class. What does encapsulation mean?
Keep within. I mean, it shouldn't be accessible from outside managers or elements.
Right.
It's kept within the wrap.
So sort of it's hidden. So it's an implement. So it's kind of like this idea here. The DB is encapsulated inside of the models. It's hidden, like nobody has direct access to it. So single responsibility states that every system should only have responsibility over a single part of the system. That's what it is. Right? So my model layer only has responsibility over the data aspect. It shouldn't know anything about the views. It shouldn't know anything about the controller. It's just responsible for data. It doesn't know how it's even going to be used. Right? All it knows is that if you need data, you can ask me data. If you need to save data, you can tell me to save data. But I don't even know what the other part of the systems are. So that way, when things, when bugs happen, it's very clear as to which part to look at, because you know that there's a bug in the data part, so it has to be in the data in the model layer. If something is broken in the UI, then you know that there has to be something broken in the UI layer. There's less things to manage in your head as a programmer. You want to make things very simple. That's essentially the idea. Okay. Cool. So going back here. So most, the MVC pattern is essentially going to be like this, right? You're going to have a route. At least when you're doing server-side rendering, you're going to have a route. You're going to get some data from the user in the form of request.body, some data coming in. You're going to use that data to either create some data in your model layer or retrieve some data. There's only two things you can do. You can either send data across to update data or get data out. Right? There's two operations, get and post. Maybe update is a third operation, but it sort of aligns with sending data across instead of getting data. Right? Once you do that, you return some response to the user. That's essentially the operations that are happening. Right? If you looked at these things, the user performs an action, and with that action, they're sending data across. Right? So it's more like it's action. Whoops. Sorry, I wanted. So it's action plus data plus input data. Right, so it's essentially these two things happening, action plus input data, and then the controller is going to either get data from the model or send data to the model using that input data from the user. And then I'm going to get some data back, and then I'm going to send the data to the view layer. Right, so let's look at let's look at some a route where we are actually retrieving data from the model layer. So in this case, where get contact ID, I'm trying to show information about a specific contact, right? Based on the the route which has the contact ID in the URL, right? So if I have a contact ID, I'm going to get it from the request.params. Essentially here I'm saying that if there's no contact ID, then call next. Otherwise, I say contacts.find by ID with my contact ID. Right? So that means this is going to give me back a contact. So when I do a .then, I get back a contact. Now I'm using this contact to render my contacts/show page. Right? So I'm essentially taking this data that I've gotten and combining it with my template to get some HTML. Remember, so the data is being sent to the view. So the data here is contact. Right, so my template has some holes about what is the name of the contact, what is the phone number, what is the address. Those are like spaces in my template, which need to be filled by the data that I get in runtime. So in runtime, I'm getting the data about which contact I'm going to try to show. Right, so it could be Phil's contact information, or it could be Alex's contact information. Right, so like it could be anybody's contact information, but that's going to be only given to me based on what route the user goes to, and I don't know that, right? Which is why I have a template, which will be like, given the data, it's going to be populated based on whatever I get. So that's essentially what's happening in most routes. I perform some database operation or some data operation, which is either create data or find data. I get the data and I send the data across to the UI. So like this flow. That's essentially all of web applications. So based on whether you're doing server-side rendering or you're doing client-side rendering, this is the flow. Doesn't matter how you're doing it. Yeah, any questions about this? What else? Single response. I think that's pretty much all I had. So the idea was to kind of give you a sense of why the folder structures were created this way, right? So there's a reason behind it. What abstractions are. So the idea is like abstractions are good because they're hiding implementation details from the caller. So what is a caller? Anybody? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Here's the person that's or the function that's essentially calling the function that you're exporting. So if I want to like heat my food, the person who's requesting the food to be heated is the caller, right? And the person implementing the heating of the food is the implementer. And then the abstraction you want to create is in between the food heating thing and the caller. Because the caller doesn't need to know exactly how to heat the food. They just want the food heated and they just want to send a message across saying, heat my food. And then the implementer will heat the food. So in this case, we want to create abstractions because abstractions are good. They hide the implementation details from the callers. All right, so that's all I had. Any final thoughts and questions? Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.